The following program contains discussion of EN server story content, which will contain some spoilers. Viewer discretion is advised. You know, this guy is sus, but so is this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and all of these guys. You know what? I'm calling an emergency meeting because there are too many suspicious individuals here. It's almost easier to find someone who isn't sus than count the number of seedy individuals an RC has. You can hardly turn a corner without running into someone with less than good intentions, and even the school's associates are up to no good. Which, of course, begs the question, who's the sussiest of all? Who among all of the students and associated individuals is the seediest, most dishonest, and most questionable suspect? Since the list of generically untrustworthy folks is so extensive, we'll need a few other criteria to use as guidelines for our decisions. We'll be looking into individuals who use deception and other seedy methods to obfuscate their true goals. The relative morality of their actions can be categorized as bad or evil. They have plotted, are plotting, or have a lot of potential to plot. And how devastating the consequences of their actions may have been or might be. With these factors in mind, we can easily knock quite a few folks off of the list. Grimm is not sus. He does have his moments, and there is some sort of thing happening with him and the block crystals, but this feels more like an MK Ultra thing to me rather than explicitly intentional on Grimm's part, so he's getting a pass. Riddle is too much of a rule follower and is too straightforward to count as a plotter. Sure, he does come up with schemes from time to time, but they are mild at best and usually for the betterment of others, not their detriment. And yes, he does overblot, but this event is isolated to his own emotions and feelings and is not really a result of any larger plot failing or some other type of subterfuge. So Riddle gets a pass. Ace does have his plans, and they are usually very simple and typically don't come at the cost of others. These plots mainly exist to get Ace out of his obligations, not world domination, so Ace gets a pass. Deuce is an honor student, and while he sometimes falls back into his delinquent ways, he does not use deception or plot. He's very straightforward with his intentions, so he is not sus. Trey has got his fellow's best interests in mind and does his best to help everyone out, not sus. Cater has some minor plots, but they are only really to get him fame on Magicam, and while he can be extra flirty, he's not doing so maliciously or deceptively, so he gets a pass. Jack follows very strong morals and is generally honest. He does go along with a certain someone's plot, but only to a point. Then his morals won out in the end, and he joins our team, albeit reluctantly. Jack, therefore, is not sus. Kaleem is just too well-meaning and too happy to be sus. If we ever find out that of all his sunshine is just a farce to hide that he's the biggest bad in the game, I'm rioting. Kaleem must be protected from the suspects, so he absolutely cannot be on their list. Vil is not as sus as one might think. Sure, he creates a toxic work environment during the Fairy Gala and is out only for his own success in most situations, but he does everything without deception mainly. The only time he's shown to be truly deceptive is during the Halloween event, which was very justified, and during the main story where his actions could have been detrimental. Outside of these interactions, he's not exactly the sneaky, plotting James Bond supervillain that this video is trying to find, so he gets a pass. Epple is extremely straightforward almost always, and even when he's not, his plots are very similar to Ace's. In my memory, there isn't really a time where Apple's schemes are ever to the detriment of anyone else, and while he's not communicative in these matters, he does have his reasoning, not sus. Ortho does try to take over the world, but boy, was he not subtle at all. He may or may not have been possessed by shades, and was technically not a real boy at that point in time. So based off of how he is post-book 6, there's no malicious intent there. Unless he's gotta save Edie from something, then out come the big guns, but I don't think that makes him sus. Silver is a sweetie pie who also does not have any malicious intent. He's devoted his life to protecting Malleus, so obviously if there is a threat to Malleus, Silver is going to get serious, but on the whole, he's very level-headed and an honest individual, not sus. Sebek is very loud, which makes him also not sus. There is no way that this guy is ever getting away with anything subtle, and I don't think deception is a concept that he understands. He's devoted, loyal, and while his actions may be detrimental to Malleus's social standing, that's not solely a Sebek problem, so I'm comfortable giving Sebek a pass. Lilia is more prankster than menacing, and while he has the potential to be very sus, I think on the whole his intentions are pure, which makes him not sus. Neji is a loyal chamberman who's trying to keep Leona on the right path, not sus. Cheka is an adorable child with no malice whatsoever, not sus. Najma is a wholesome younger sister just trying to have some fun, even if she does steal Jamil's food, but that's a pretty normal sibling thing, so not sus. Dia is a hardworking lady whose priority is Deuce, not sus. Marja's a wholesome grandma with a competitive side, not sus. Stitch is just trying to get home, not sus. Gantu is very goal-oriented and he does yoink Grim to use as a bargaining chip, but can you blame him after having to deal with the chaotic trio of Lilia, Floyd, and Stitch? Not sus. The Sooms are essentially just the same characters but in squishy Soom form, so the Sooms of whoever is not sus are also not sus, and those of whoever are sus are equally as sus. That leaves, in no particular order, Rook, Azul, Jade, Floyd, Malleus, Leona, Ruggy, Idiot, Jamil, Ernesto, Rolo, Eliza, and by extension the rest of the Phantom Bride ghosts, and all of the Spectral Soiree ghosts. This is still a long list, but it is more manageable, so let's see who's the least sus and work our way up from there. In last place, we have the Spectral Soiree ghosts. During the Spectral Soiree, there are many ghosts who seem to be up to no good. At the start of the event, some kiddos have been yoinked from their sleep, and those that remain receive a mysterious invitation to a party beyond the veil. It is assumed, with such limited knowledge, that this invitation is in fact a threat, given that some of the students are missing. This misinterpretation sets off a chain of misunderstandings, which in turn creates the plot for the event. However, during this whole thing, not once does any of the kiddos approach a ghost with the invitation to ask for clarification, at which point I'm sure things would have been cleared up and the hunt for the mirror shards would have then become more collaborative or more game-like versus life and death. On the whole, this group of ghosts is only sus because of this misunderstanding, and I think our boys would have had a better time had literally anyone asked an actual question. Assuming, of course, the ghosts would have given up a little bit of their escape room antics, and if not for the non-consensual possession of the missing characters, the ghosts might have gotten a pass altogether. However, these possessions are extremely naughty and only serve to artificially increase the difficulty of the event they've set up. While solving puzzles may be all the rage, saving your friends from an unseen force that could very well totally consume them if you don't intervene is not a good time. It does seem like these actions were taken in part because of a certain other someone's involvement in this whole party, or at least was done so with their blessing, given how the dramatic end unravels. But on the whole, I think the initial idea of the possessions and of the escape room itself came from the ghosts, and they deliberately obfuscated their intentions, which caused unnecessary harm. Well, our boys didn't exactly give them a chance to explain either, so... The ghosts of the Spectral Soiree make the suspect list via a technicality. Were their intentions evil? No. But was the miscommunication and misunderstanding enough to convince everyone else that they were? Yes. At the end of the day, everyone has a great time at the party and no one was seriously injured, so the ghosts are getting put at the very bottom of the barrel. Next up is Malleus Draconia. On the whole, he is not a very sus individual, just more so intimidating. However, he does have his moments. The big thing with Malleus is that he doesn't ever communicate his intentions with anyone else, which ends up being deceptive. It's not intentional, I'm sure, as he's rather forthcoming if you were to ask him outright, but it does make his actions sneaky and questionable. But because of this, his actions are unfortunately accidentally evil. There's no malice in him when he concocts his plans, none whatsoever. and even when he's being insensitive, it's mainly out of ignorance, which doesn't excuse it, but it does make it very different from the motivations of other folks on this list. Sure, he teleports the rest of the house wardens and the head mage to Deisomnia without their knowledge or consent, but he's only doing that to make sure that they end up all together. Of course, his logic is very flawed, and his actions are not okay, and he does not explain himself well at all, but the consequences are rather small in the grand scheme of things. Sure, putting everyone to sleep will effectively stop Lilia from dying, and it will stop Malleus from losing everyone else to mortality, but this action will likely end up with him being way more alone and isolated than he already was once everyone does wake up, given their theoretical resentment towards him. He could easily overcome someone with magic or overwhelm his foes. However, those sorts of things can end up causing a lot of trouble for the Briar Valley and himself if he's not careful, so he generally tends to shy away from that. Malleus tries very well to ensure that what he's doing reflects well on the Briar Valley, and he's very attached to the people that are close to him, but his naivete about the world at large trips him up from time to time. Sure, he wants the ghosts in the Spectral Soiree to have a good Halloween, but he doesn't tell anyone about his plan and in a way is slightly, or perhaps directly, responsible for the miscommunication during the event. He and Lilia even pretend to be possessed towards the end, which only makes things worse overall. I don't think his actions are inherently bad or evil since his motivations aren't, but they can certainly come across that way, all things considered. Given how aloof he seems to be, it's no wonder that folks are suspicious of him, and because of his immense power, he can cause dire, lasting harm. Malleus does meet the qualities we are considering, he just doesn't do so very well, and on the whole, he's not malicious, so I'm putting him at number 12. Next up is Edius Shroud, who is not very much of a threat until he is. Edia's unique talents can be used for the great harm or great betterment of civilization. However, he's pretty content to do neither most of the time. He does use his technological prowess when it's requested or when it directly benefits him, which could make him suspicious to some, but this isn't done due to malice and his actions don't seem to be evil even if sometimes they are a bit misguided. It's hard to make a case for Edia to be suspicious on the surface since he appears to be a recluse who doesn't talk or do very much. Being introverted and socially anxious are not crimes or evil or deliberately deceiving, and the only lasting consequence of spending all day in your room is that you don't get to experience life outside of said room. While none of this makes Edia inherently sus, the mystery surrounding him can make him suspicious to others. It's the quiet ones you've got to watch out for, and Edia's not only got a big secret, but several reasons to try to take over the world, which are what got him put on this list. Edia is the heir to Styx, a top-secret organization that's tasked with handling blot disasters. This gives Edia a noble reason to be deceptive, as Styx is not only a closely guarded secret, but neither the organization nor their mission are inherently evil. Edia's reclusive nature makes it easier for him to keep this secret, but it also affects his sense of self and his hope for the future. He declines internship after internship because of his future at Styx, a fate from which he cannot escape, and this unconscious resentment leads to his biggest crime yet, trying to take over the world with blot monsters. This is largely fronted by shady Ortho, but none of Book 6's later events could have happened if Edia didn't open the gate to the underworld. Edia's strong desire to reunite with Ortho, to be out in the world, and to not have to take any poop from anyone ever again drive him towards his overblot. Edia and Ortho can be seen sporadically talking about how everything feels like an RPG, and Edia relishes in being the BBG here. Even before his overblot, he seems to take on this role with a little bit of glee, which I think makes him suspicious. Why are you so happy to be the big boss, Edia? Are you secretly power-hungry or something? Should we be letting the secretly power-hungry introvert have control over some of the world's most deadly creatures? And of all the entirety of the technology at Styx? Well, even with his plot to take over the world and the results of that action being catastrophic should he have succeeded, Idia overall just isn't that bad of a guy and doesn't have that many bad intentions. He never comes across as particularly shady, and because Ortha was so forthcoming during the whole debacle, it's hard for me to count Idia as deliberately deceptive. The plot also wasn't really technically his either, but because he was a real boy and in full control of his faculties and kind of relished in everything that was going on at the time of the event, I do have to give him some sus points. It's not enough to outdo our other contenders, but I do think it is more intentional than Malleus's fault. So, Idia is at number 11. Coming in at number 10, we have Eliza, Puffy, and the rest of the band. These ghosts are very suspicious indeed, since their motives and methods are all rather seedy. Let's take someone from their home, make sure they can't escape, and then end their life because it suits our needs. Absolutely wild. Everyone during this event is very forthcoming with their intentions, so deception isn't at play here. But there is a lot of plot afoot to get Eliza hitched under any means necessary, and every single ghost plays some sort of role in that nefarious plot. Marriage itself is not nefarious, of course, if it's undergone consensually, but that's the big problem here. Eliza yoinks Idia under the cover of night, her and her entourage make sure he can't escape, and no one is at all concerned for his well-being at any point during this event on the ghost side or the student side. I think the relative morality of the combined actions of all the ghosts is borderline evil, but it gets taken over the edge when even Puffy admits that he knows it's wrong but doesn't care because he wants Eliza to be happy. That's the motivation that these ghosts have, yet at the same time I can't believe them for a second since none of them are actually counseling Eliza in a way to make sure that she is 100% actually happy and going to stay that way. I have a very sneaky suspicion that the ghosts are so forceful for this union just to get Eliza off of their backs and to fulfill their own selfish desires, which makes their intentions nefarious in both ways. If this is the case, anyways, it seems to be well hidden from Eliza, who can't even figure out what she could possibly be doing wrong, and even her own desires are very selfish and are being acted out in a way that is less than desirable. The consequences of her actions are also catastrophic, but in a less grandiose sense than Idia's attempted world takeover or Malleus's. But to unalive someone just for your own happiness is very evil. Also, if Idia became a ghost, Ortha would riot, which would then result in the complete destruction of the school and potentially a few accidental unalivings to boot. As much as I dislike these ghosts and their actions, they aren't subtle and are very forthcoming when asked, plus their plot technically isn't revolutionary considering Eliza is not the only ghost bride in existence, nor is she the worst of them, somehow. Are these ghosts sus? Absolutely. But are they the worst of the worst based on our criteria? No. But I do think here there is intent to harm where there wasn't, or at least as much, in any of the previous cases, so Eliza and her pals are getting ranked above everyone else at number 10. But in number 9, we have Ruggy Butchie. This hyena seems like a good bean on the surface, and he does some good things here and there, but this guy is always scheming to get his next meal or paycheck from whatever source he can. Morals? Huh. Ruggy laughs in the face of morals, and why wouldn't he? He had a rough and tough upbringing where he had to fight for everything he had, so why would that stop now just because he's at NRC? This doesn't justify his actions, not really, but it does provide appropriate context for them and some nuance to Ruggy's character overall. The largest issue with Ruggy, I think, is his sticky fingers. We get this fact established very early on in Book 2 and in the original Fairy Gala, where his talents are critical for the retrieval of the Mage Stone. It's also established early on that Ruggy takes what he can get from any source. He works at the lounge to scrounge up some money during a very busy day. He does a lot of work for Leona for the kickbacks, including sometimes getting tossed Leona's wallet for purchases. He uses his special magic to trick others into giving him things like he does with Grim Sandwich, and he's always playing dirty if he can get away with it. All of this makes Ruggy a very seedy individual with less than pure intentions, whose smile is just as dangerous as it is dazzling. There are two things that Ruggy lacks, though: true malicious intent and grand ambition. Ruggy is out for himself, but he doesn't seem to care about getting a leg up on everyone everywhere. He's just trying to survive the now and bounces from hustle to hustle. While doing so, he's not out to directly hurt anyone, and if you happen to get upset by his sticky fingers, that's mainly your problem, right? He's not stealing Grimm's sandwich to explicitly upset Grimm or get back at him in any way. Ruggy's doing it to get further with Leona and onto better goals there. Ruggy, on the whole, is very cunning, but he doesn't seem to be thinking about the bigger picture, which I think makes him less menacing than some of the other folks we'll get to later. His plots are also only about himself and aren't usually meant to destroy civilizations. But even still, Ruggy does affect those around him and still does cause a lot of chaos. While not directly responsible for the scheme of Book 2, Ruggy is an extremely willing participant who is also a very key player. He has no qualms about hurting other folks throughout the story leading up to the Spell Drive tournament, nor does he care at all for anyone during the stampede he causes. Stampedes are so incredibly dangerous, it is a miracle that no one died during those events. Even though Malleus could have very easily just flown over the crowd to avoid harm, which is such a fantastic example of how short-sighted this plan was overall. The fact is that Ruggy was complicit in the attempted maiming or unaliving of him and others, and that is very unnerving. After that event, he just moved right along to his next gig. Like, dude, think about your actions, please. I think the consequences here added to Ruggy's general shady nature make him much more sus than some of our previous contenders, but he's not the sussiest out there. In fact, in number 8, we have Rook Hunt. Now, Rook is not the most evil, I guess, of our suspects. Rook's actions, while incredibly creepy, are generally positive in nature, and he doesn't technically check off any of our boxes. His intentions are very clear unless you can't understand his flowery language. He doesn't really plot anything nefarious, although I suppose you could count his subtle nudging of Vil to take on the Brain Cell Boys for the SDC as a plot, but that doesn't really have any negative connotations. Rook saves Nej's life in Book 5, technically also saving Vil's life, and because of his creepy tendencies, we're able to resolve the events of Book 6 and save the world, which is the complete opposite of evil and very positive. So what is Rook doing here? Why is he ranked this high? Why isn't he back with Edia, for who all intents and purposes probably should have been ranked a little bit higher? Well, dear viewer, this is because Rook Hunt creeps me out so much that I had to include him despite Rook not meeting our criteria. He's not going to take glory away from anyone else, I don't think, but I do think that his overall susness is greater than all of those who have come before. Rook can glance at you and know your height, weight, measurements, what color underwear you've got on, the last meal you ate, what your favorite color is, and more. He's ridiculously perceptive, which makes him very threatening, at least to me, but it also means that nothing can be put past him. I think it's incredibly creepy for your first interaction with him, for him to then tell you your name, your height, and like your class. It's wild. That has to be suspicious, right? He might allow you to lie to him, but he and you will both know the truth the entire time. His obsession with beauty can be a bit much, as his dedication to both Nej and Vil is a lot. Plus, the way that he looks at Leona and wishes to hunt him all day, every single day, is something else entirely. Rook is, on the whole, extremely creepy, and I think that this makes him incredibly suspicious, but he has so much charisma that he's able to get away with it. And I think, at the end of the day, that should make him much more terrifying. I think it's also worth noting that Rook is a photo hobbyist, which doesn't sound bad on paper until you consider his Soom card, and I'm a little concerned. Could the Soom be delighted by a lovely landscape? Yes. Is that likely what's going on given this corner of Rook's room and the other photo that Rook is showing them? No. And while there's no way for us to tell for sure what's happening here, I think it's safe to assume that the contents of the photos are at least shocking in some way, Or perhaps it's just one of Nej, but either way, this whole situation is suspicious. Also, this corner in his room, mega suspicious. How has no one in this universe mentioned, seen, or otherwise touched on this at all? Vil, can you get your Vice House Warden, please? So even though Rook's actions are not inherently deceptive, morally evil, the result of a plot, and don't have devastating consequences, he is still so suspicious, just in general, that he's beating out Edia, Ruggy, Malleus, and the ghosts. But I think to keep things on brand, our next person needs to be someone that's a little more morally gray. And who could be better at that than Floyd? Why is Floyd so terrifying? Well, Floyd is a menace in every sense of the word, and even though he doesn't incite a stampede with world war potential, or take creepy candids of other people, or try to take over the world in various ways, he absolutely has the potential to do way worse things. Or at least, take over the world. I suppose that's probably a pretty darn bad thing. Anyways, he's going to laugh the whole time that he's doing it as well, which is wild. Floyd's deception isn't very obvious since he's rather forthcoming with his intentions. However, you usually only get that information after he's already gone and done something ridiculous. Usually these actions are taken as a result of Floyd being bored, which means this dude's moral compass is not only broken, but has been thrown off a cliff into the abyss. He is out solely for his own entertainment without a care to the chaos it's causing others. Somehow, someway, Jade and Azul are able to rein him in sometimes, and Floyd does have to deal with the consequences of his actions every now and again, but both him and his brother fit the suspicious role very, very well. Since Floyd's intentions are never clear until he starts doing things, you never quite know where you stand with him or what trouble you're going to end up being involved in. This makes Floyd menacing, but also in a way acts as its own kind of obfuscation. Since there is no way to tell what he's thinking until he starts acting, Floyd's thought process is shrouded in mystery. How he thinks, what leads up to his actions, and how he resolves those actions are unknowns, which make him a very scary individual for sure. Plotting isn't a huge thing for Floyd, that's more of Jade, but his actions do skew on the bad side. Big red button that we're not supposed to press? Smash it. No beans to capture the monsters with? Time to use fists. Puppets that we're not supposed to thrash? Who gives a flying fish? In fact, Floyd was such a bad boy in Playful Land that the puppets put a bag over his head to muzzle him so he couldn't bite them anymore. He gets full points. Because Floyd has a devil-may-care attitude, the consequences of his actions are also largely on the bad side, though I wouldn't classify them as catastrophic. Sometimes these consequences are limited to him, like when he ate all of the strawberries for a private event and had to work at the lounge to make up for it. But other times they involve other people like Riddle or Jamil who then have to suffer with him. Menacing doesn't directly correlate to sus, but I think Floyd's unique blend of menacing is pretty darn suspicious. Out of the three Octagonal boys though, Floyd is the least so he's the only coming in at number 7. Now up next, you might be a little surprised to see Ernesto Falworth here this early. Ernesto is not higher up on the list for one little reason. He is too obviously sus. Sure, his deception is unparalleled when put to the vital signs test, but you gotta admit that he's just so obvious. Outside of that, I know, you know, the main cast knows that something foul is afoot. But we all go along for the ride regardless because of the perceived benefits. There is never any doubt that Ernesto will eventually betray us, not in the slightest, and every word out of his mouth or action he takes contains this underlying threat. Even during his Part 5 schmoozing, we all know that he's lying through his teeth and just trying to scrape by until he can get back on top. It took me 2 seconds to recognize when he was using his unique magic on our boys, and it was pretty easy to figure out what exactly it was doing. Subtlety is not Ernesto's specialty, but because of this, he gets overlooked very easily, which puts him in a very powerful position from which he can enact his schemes. Ernesto turned his great weakness into a great strength, and because he is underestimated, he can afford to slip up from time to time without drawing too much extra suspicion. By the time the day is halfway over, our boys have let their guard down completely because Ernesto is so sus, but nothing bad has happened yet. And his magic is so pitiful, how could anything bad possibly happen? He even tells them the truth at one point, only to laugh it off, and because his unique magic is suggestive, everyone laughs it off too. The trap is laid and everyone is walking straight into it willingly, which is truly terrifying. However, he's getting ranked low because the plot that he's embroiled in is fantastically terrifying and has very real consequences, but it's not his. Turning unsuspecting parkgoers into puppets and having the backing of someone so powerful and so influential that even a celebrity disappearance like Vil is not a cause for concern is not only bonkers, but extremely scary. And I think that it goes without saying that turning someone into a puppet is a kind of death, which makes Ernesto by extension an unaliver, and that's objectively evil. But because this plot is not of his creation, and he's just following somebody else's instructions, he can't be considered the mastermind and he cannot take the credit for it. He uses deception. The relative morality of his actions are not good, and the consequences of his actions are devastating, but those consequences are coming largely from someone other than himself, and he, again, is not the person that's making those decisions. He's not attached to the scheme itself, nor the overall goal. He's just your run-of-the-mill schmoozer who happened to get a high-profile job. In my book, this means the highest he can be is right here at number 6. He's got a lot of the qualities we're looking for, but he's just not the full package. However, in number 5, we have Azul Ashengrotto, who is much closer to this goal. This guy is constantly cooking up some sort of plot, and these plots usually aren't well-meaning. He's got schemes for days, blackmailing or convincing the head mage to allow him to operate the lounge, getting free labor by exploiting others' weaknesses, trying to take over Ramshackle while also getting the last remaining photo of him out in the wild, selling Sebek laundry detergent in an effort to endear himself to Deosomnia, selling Eel moisturizer to Vil to get on his good side, trying and succeeding to get the rights to Sam's mystery drink. The list goes on and on. Most of these actions only benefit Azul directly, so in a way you could say that his intentions are not inherently bad or evil. However, in order to benefit himself, he usually has to screw over someone else, and his contractees usually end up with the short end of the stick. Does this make him evil, though? Most, if not all of the folks seeking a contract do so entering willingly and in order to reap some sort of reward for themselves. Azul does disclose relevant information, but he's not going to do so in big bold letters either, so overall the interactions are still kind of shady. The argument I see most often in Ursula's favor is that she's completely upfront with the cost of Ariel's contract, so Ariel had all of the information to make an informed decision and decide she does. With Azul, though, this information is not always clearly defined, even if it is there, as is the case with the Brain Cell Boys contracts, so I think in a way this counts as deception. Ursula was extremely forthcoming and spelled everything out clearly. Azul apparently did not do that in the same way, so I'm going to put him in the deceptive box. It also doesn't help that Azul's main motivation for all of his actions is profit, and how he views that profit is a little spooky. His motivations during Book 3 are centered around retribution, which is kind of a profit, but just not in the traditional sense. Clawing his way to the top by deceiving and stealing from others is not at all morally righteous, but because Azul feels slighted by his past and the people in it, he desperately wants no one to ever be able to look down on him again and feels justified in this. The only way he feels this can be achieved is to get on top of everyone in the world, starting with NRC. For our considerations in this video, this makes him a classic villain, one who is only out for himself and who doesn't care just how far he has to go in order to get what he thinks he deserves. Does Azul do this in a spectacular world-ending fashion? Not quite. But his rampant use of magic right before his overblot, including trying to forcibly take Jade and Floyd's special magic, is a classically evil move. If he were to have acquired everyone's special everything and continued to artificially increase his blot tolerance, magic reserves, and other talents via contracts, the consequences could be very catastrophic. It only takes one bad deal for the House of Cards to crumble, but until then, all of those affected are left in Azul's wake, which, if he had continued down that path, could have included folks with way more sway over the world, like government officials, perhaps, which could have contributed to a much larger situation. There is a limit, I think, to Azul's impact specifically, and it can be reversed to a point with the destruction of the contracts, so Azul isn't going to win the crown, but I do think he's formidable enough to have earned his spot at number 5. Now, in number 4, we have the real mastermind of Book 2's events, Leona Kingscholar. Leona's not exactly a good role model for his dorm, or for anyone really, but he does do a decent enough job leading folks to have the unconditional support of his dorm. This is a very scary thing, which he manipulates to wield as a sword against Malleus in Book 2. But before we get into that, I must also note that Leona's wickedly smart and also unafraid to use underhanded methods to get what he wants. He'll manipulate the situation subtly to get away with whatever his goal may be, which can be as innocent as Vil sewing on his buttons for him, or Neji staying behind while the rest of the group heads to the hot springs. But it can also be much more nefarious too. Leona really does have Scar's sharpness, and he uses it well throughout the story. It's also worth mentioning that his special magic is particularly terrifying since it can essentially snap anything and everything out of existence. Leona is Thanos without the determination, and thank God for that, because if he had a little bit more fire under his butt, Leona could be extremely deadly. Even with this terrifying power, Leona is charismatic and situationally level-headed, so he doesn't come across as particularly shady overall. I think his lazy nature also helps to cover up his susness, since it's easy to dismiss him as lazy and not acknowledge his other talents. But it doesn't mean that Leona's shady side isn't there, or that he's going to keep everything above board. He plots and schemes up a whole plan that would at least maim, best case scenario, unalive Malleus, and Leona gets his entire dorm to go along with it under the guise of winning sports ball. He got a bunch of teenagers to aid him in potentially starting a multinational conflict. I just don't have any words when it comes to this for this specific consideration. I feel like Leona's susness and otherwise nefarious demeanor kind of speaks for itself. However, I don't feel that Leona is the most nefarious or suspicious individual, since on the whole, Leona really can't be bothered to do anything actually productive. He could weaponize his charisma and all of these other things in much worse ways than he actually does. There are rare instances where he uses his talents for his schemes and goes along with these plans, but you almost have to force it out of him unless it's something he's extremely passionate about. So while he is suspicious, there are still a few better candidates remaining in our pool. Coming in at number 3 is Jade Leach. Now, Jade is without a doubt a very suspicious individual. However, it's also a little more obvious with him than our last 2 contenders. On the surface, you probably wouldn't guess that Jade could completely destroy your life because he's nothing like Floyd. He's much more personable and polite, and you'd probably offer up information without even realizing it. Trey, in fact, is rather sympathetic towards Jade until he learns about the roster of blackmail information Jade compiled. Since Jade works in the shadows, he doesn't have to try as hard to deceive folks, and he can hide his intentions exceptionally well. He can be polite, cordial, and keep up this front even when he's being devious, which draws a lot of suspicion. He's even so lovely to the ghost bride that he probably wouldn't have ever gotten caught had Floyd not called him out. And yet, when Floyd does, Jade readily admits the truth with the same delightful cadence as his earlier honey words, which is just terrifying. You may not know Floyd's intentions until he acts, but you'll never ever know Jade's intentions even after he acts, and that makes him way, way worse. Some things are easier to see through, like when his Soom's plot gets him in trouble, but on the whole, you'll never really know where you stand, meaning you'd constantly have to be suspicious of him. Even Azul has admitted as much, and he grew up with the guy. It's almost a wonder that Jade only made it to number 3. However, I don't think Jade is being deceptive for a grand world-ending scheme. Rather, he just thinks that it's fun. His personal enjoyment trumps everything, and he would even drop Azul in a minute if he thought Azul was being boring. His motivations are entirely selfish from what we can see, and he's level-headed enough to know when he can no longer push his goals. Eels are cautious by nature, as Floyd points out in Bean's Day, so Jade isn't going to be risky or completely throw caution to the wind. Because he's more calculating in this way, it's likely he won't ever become too large of a threat or take on too risky of a job, so he's staying put right where he's at ranking-wise. His actions on the whole can be considered bad, however, I wouldn't necessarily categorize them as evil, since the consequences of his actions are also pretty localized. I can't really give him too many points here, and I do think that he has a lot of potential to be way more nefarious, as he can plot exceptionally well, like we see in Bean's Day, but his plot is also kind of localized, because I don't think Jade would have enacted his plans if he didn't already have a lot of information on Azul and the monster team during that event. I think Jade is likely not going to act without some sort of guarantee. However, he does have the means to get all of the information that he would need to become a legitimate threat and do damage in a very major way if he chose to. I think he could take over the world quietly with a bit more ambition, but I don't see him actively doing that, unlike some other folks. And unless his family is truly a mafia, I don't really know that that would be the career path that he wants in the future. However, I think on the whole, he's an extremely suspicious individual that has a lot of the qualities that we're looking for, just not quite in the right amounts. The individual in number 2, then, well, you know how Azul could have influenced governments to a point? Do you know who could do that to a much larger degree with even worse repercussions? Ones that couldn't easily be reversed with the shredding of a contract? That's right, taking home the silver medal is Jamil Viper, a very scary and influential individual who has a real talent for real villainy. The only thing holding Jamil back, honestly, is the consideration he has for his family and how the consequences of his actions might affect them. But if he didn't have to worry about that, he might be a much looser cannon. If you want to talk about deception, Jade is a fine source. However, Jamil's a bit better since he can actually hide his sinister nature way better. With Jade, you always kind of know that there's something going on, but with Jamil, you might not even recognize that that's happening. Plus, with Jamil's special magic, he could convince you that his influence never even happened, or that what he suggested was just your idea in the first place, so you'd never be the wiser. This could wreak havoc for the world at large, given that he's the right-hand man to one of the world's most influential rulers. The Alassims are one of the biggest families in the Scalding Sands, and I think that they do run most of it, but I'm not 100% sure that they have the full influence. However, even still, they could become the 100% biggest, baddest family in the Scalding Sands with a little bit of cunning, which Jamil could easily provide. There was a lovely Discord server member who brought up the question of why Jamil didn't wait until later to use his powers to influence Kaleem and therefore run the Scalding Sands government by using Kaleem as his puppet, and I don't have an answer for that, but I do think that the overall concept they brought up makes Jamil extremely scary, and in theory could actually happen. This is kind of what we see happening with Jafar in the movie, and unless Jamil had some sort of Aladdin counterpart to call him out on it, he could probably just get away with it. All of that is hypothetical, and while it is very dangerous, it has yet to happen and may not be likely to happen given the events of Book 4. But Jamil hasn't really stopped being a sneaky snake since then, and he's not afraid to get his hands dirty even still. Jamil and Ruggy work very closely together during Glorious Masquerade to convince some poor kiddos to take the fall for them so they can get away from the Fire Lotuses. And this plot can be attributed largely to Jamil since he's the one who suggests things to Ruggy. Jamil's actions during Book 4 are also extremely underhanded, and the lasting consequences could have been dire. But Jamil would let thousands of students faint in the desert before he lets Kaleem continue to be house warden, so he gets major sus points and deviousness points for this. You can see him getting extremely upset when Azul intervenes, in part because Azul is making sure that the conditions are workable, which works against, of course, his plan. But this does make me think that Jamil probably was intending for people to get hurt to a degree that would have been irreversible for Kaleem's reputation, which means that if someone just happened to stop existing, it wouldn't have been the biggest problem for him, which is very, very concerning indeed. While some of the other overblottees on this list might have had grander impacts to their overblots, and the actions leading up to them might have been quite nasty as well, I think Jamil just takes the cake with how well thought out his plan was. If he hadn't decided to involve the MC, then he likely would have gotten away with it too. The only reason that Octavanel even gets involved is because of us, and the only reason we're even there is because of Jamil's initial insistence. I don't think anyone would have figured out he was the cause of the events if we had not intervened. Whereas in Leona's case, for example, it would have absolutely been found out at some point. Jamil wasn't leaving any loose ends, he wasn't involving anyone else, and he was set up to succeed if not for his own hubris. This would have left lasting consequences on not only Kaleem, but the whole of the Scalding Sands and their allies by proxy, which could also have led to many future conflicts, maybe even wars? Who's to say? That's all very hypothetical, but I do think of all of our NRC students, Jamil is the most sus, and he hides it the best, which makes him even more dastardly. So Jamil takes home number 2. Which leaves the number 1 spot for Rollo Flam. Rollo is so unsuspecting, so articulate, so normal, that his heel turn during Glorious Masquerade is divine. He isn't suspicious at all when you meet him, and that's what makes him the most menacing villain we've had so far on this list, and therefore the greatest suspect of all. I know that sounds counterintuitive, and perhaps at face value it is, but because Rollo can get his scheme done so subtly, with so much deception, and with it having devastating consequences for the entire world, he fills out our qualifications and then some. Plus, now given the aftermath of that event, there is absolutely no way that I could ever trust him again, and I think a lot of the main cast feels the same way too, which immediately skyrockets his susness. Rollo has every means to deny any possible suspicion with his position and reputation as Student Council President. But because of that position, he also has to be extremely careful when he's acting on his schemes. He works in the shadows similar to Jade and Jamil, so his wits need to be sharp. He leverages his reputation to manipulate his fellows and the other schools into attending the social, and he specifically entices Malleus to be the finest sacrifice. This level of diabolical outweighs his seemingly innocent nature and puts him on a completely different tier compared to the rest of our suspects. There are some times throughout the story where we can see cracks in Rollo's armor show, which could raise a brow if you were paying enough attention, but they are there even though no one notices them. Rollo's plan would not only doom the current generation either, but all future generations in a variety of ways, making the consequences of his actions more devastating than some of our other contenders. Technically, you could say that this also could be true for Jamil, given that if Kaleem is not the leader then of the Scalding Sands, had his plans also worked, then there could have been lasting consequences for the Scalding Sands in general. Sure. But Rollo isn't done plotting either, even after he was caught, as he readily admits to Malleus and the gang that he has no intention of stopping now. While I don't think that Jamil is necessarily content after the events of Book 4, I don't think he's going to try something like that again. But Rollo absolutely will. This means that we have a strong bingo across the board. Rollo just does everything so well, and is, in my opinion, the closest character we have to that evil mastermind James Bond villain that I've been imagining during this consideration. Have I watched James Bond at any point in recent memory? No. But I think that Rollo fits this bill very, very well. And I think that he fits all four of our criteria as well as anyone could. As players, we have the foresight to know that Rollo is the villain, and that can color our perception of him as a character and the actions that he takes. But in universe, there are very few signs that point toward his plot. Rollo's master plan is done so well and so secretively that not even his fellow classmates have any suspicion that he was behind it. Not a single soul suspects him. In fact, he probably would have gotten away with the whole thing too if it weren't for those meddling RSA kids. Without their intervention, our boys would have gone down with the flowers, and Twisted Wonderland would be a very different place, one that matches Rollo's vision. While the threat of losing one's magic is very abstract to me, considering I do not have magic, it is established fairly early on in the main story that a mage losing their magic is akin to actually losing their head, i.e. unalivement. In this way, Rollo is effectively executing an entire demographic of people, and what do we call that, my lovely viewers? Genocide. I'm not sure if mages count as an ethnic group, considering that all sorts of different races and cultures have mages. But what I do know for certain is that the Fae are absolutely a race where magic is vital to their very existence. Given how much disdain Rollo shows for the Fae, Malleus in particular, and given who he's twisted from, yeah, he's not getting away from the accusation. There are very few things that can top that on my evil scale, so Rollo's placement is quite firm in my mind. I suppose sus is not exactly the right title for him, but after everything that went down in Glorious Masquerade, I cannot ever trust him again, like I mentioned before, so I can only ever be suspicious of Rollo, and I think that this distrust is what truly earned him this spot in my list. There is no potential for redemption with someone like him. There is potential for redemption with everyone else that's on the list. Rollo's attitude, though, and his internal moral justification for his actions is so strong that I just don't see him ever seeking repentance, and I think that that makes him pretty irredeemable. Although genocide is also not exactly a redeemable thing that you can come back from. I'm sorry. I love him so much as a villain, but like, come on. All illusions of innocence have been shattered for me, so Rollo will be crowned our sussiest suspect and shall be sentenced to 1,000 years in naughty jail. Good luck in there, buddy. Now, some of you may have noticed that there is an individual who was not counted in this consideration. However, they are very, very suspicious. And while there is a lot going on with them, I don't feel that we have as strong evidence to their true intentions like we do with some of the other suspects. However, because they are just so interesting, we'll say, I had to talk about them, albeit briefly. So our suspect number 0, the OG sussy boy of Twisted Wonderland, is Dyer Crowley. Now, we get introduced to Crowley very early on in the story. In fact, he is the second character that we meet. And from that time onwards, he is rather suspicious in a variety of ways. He is supposed to be the head mage of a very influential college, yet he doesn't take responsibility for any of his actions and ropes the MC into pretty much every plot. He's supposed to have the well-being of the students in mind, however, this generally goes to the wayside, particularly when the consequences of the students' actions would cause a headache for him. After most of the overblots, he just kind of wipes his hands clean of the situation and continues onwards. Even when Ambrose calls him out, he is reluctant to admit that anything is wrong. Now, is Ambrose the correct person for him to admit things to? Probably not, given the relationship between RSA and NRC. But the fact remains that Crowley is very deceptive in what he tries to hide from the world at large. He doesn't want the media or any other source outside of the college to get any inkling that anything bad might be happening. He wants to maintain the reputation of the college at all costs, and the costs generally are the students that are attending that college. It's very backwards, and I don't fully understand why Crowley is as negligent as he is. And in some ways, this makes him even worse than some of our previous suspects, given that he is not so directly, but directly involved in Jamil's overblot, given that he is willing to put Kaleem as house warden, even though he does not deserve that position. And there are other times, too, where him putting us in a position that is very awkward doesn't really make a lot of sense, since there should be things that he can administratively do. He takes bribes from Azul to start the lounge at the college, which is something that just I don't understand. In almost every single workplace environment, you have to take compliance trainings, which usually include anti-bribery, anti-harassment, etc. types of things. There is absolutely no way that Crowley is not taking these at some point in time, or maybe he's just ignoring them. I don't really know. But in a realistic sense, he should be very well aware that his actions are not at all proper, given his position at the school. Being as negligent as he is, there are dire consequences, and I think that the 7 overblots are very, very clearly a result of, at least in part, his negligence. And while he does have resources available to them, I don't really know if they're ever advertised or if there's any effort to actually promote that these resources exist to the students, which would be something that I feel he should be championing, especially after the second overblot. Like, if you have 1, that's something out of the ordinary. But now you're up to 6? Now you're on to your 7th? What are you doing? Why have you not taken any sort of action? There's so much unknowns about him and his motivations, and while he comes off as a very goofy character, I just don't trust him. However, I don't really know where to place him on our list of suspects because I can't readily quantify his deception or his evilness or his, the consequences of his actions, although I suppose I can for that one. I suppose those are pretty clear. But I don't really know what to do with him. And I feel like I kind of need to know what his underlying motivations are before I can put him anywhere. But if I had to rank him, and if I had actually remembered to consider him during my initial ranking, this wouldn't be an issue, which is part of the reason that he is subject number 0. But I think realistically, if I had to put him somewhere in the list, I wouldn't rank him any lower than number 4. I'm a little torn between him being susser than Jade or being just right below Jade. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I do think that Crowley has the potential to get very close to Rolo, depending on what his actual motivations are. If he's just a goofball that doesn't want to take responsibility for his own actions and therefore causes a lot of coincidental consequences for all of those around him, I think he's probably good at number 4. If there are more nefarious reasons as to why he does not involve himself more in the actual day-to-day job that he is supposed to be doing, and maybe there is, I'm not entirely sure, then I think he could squeak up to maybe 3 or 2. I don't know that he would beat out Rolo, at least in my mind, but there is no denying that Crowley is extremely sus. I just don't know that he's as villainous as what I'm trying to consider here. Only time will tell where the bird inevitably ranks, but for now, since he is the OG sussy boy, he is getting the big old goose egg. And again, it is not at all because I forgot to rank him in every revision of the script. It is because he is the OG that he is here. So with that, this is my final ranking of all of the boys that I consider to be villainously sus. This is fun, I think, although I did have to revise the script a number of times because it was just so hard to determine who goes where, given just how nefarious these boys can be. But I am content with where I have placed folks. However, you may be able to change my mind. I don't know, try down below. And if you liked this video and want to see more content like it, let me know that too. You could leave a comment or a like, or maybe even a subscribe. Who knows? Y'all work in mysterious ways after all. But before you go, I would like to remind you that you're amazing, and I hope you have a wonderful day.